Our panellists include Kay Rundle, former CEO, Maribyrnong, Geelong, Port Phillip Councils, and former president of LG Pro. Thank you, Kay.
Yay.
Roberto Calanzi, Councillor, Yarra City Council in his first term. Welcome, Roberto, and thanks for coming along. Councillor Angela Eltier, long-time councillor, and present-day Mayor, Hobsons Bay Council and current board member of the MAV. Thank you, Angela. Judy Madigan. Judy Madigan is a former municipal librarian in the city of Footscray. She's a former Essendon councillor. She's a former state member of Parliament, and she was Victoria's first female speaker of the Legislative Assembly. Former councillors, they always come back to the family. Always come back. Councillor Susan Riley is the Deputy Mayor, Melbourne City Council. Susan Riley, thank you for coming along and fitting this into your agenda. John Benny, who arrived late. Let's not forget John. CEO, City of Greater Dandenong. Former CEO of Manningham and past president of LG Pro, and an all-round good guy. John, thank you for coming along today as well. Former Mayor, Port Phillip. Former president of the MAV, author, fashion model. He's an eccentric, and we love him. Dick Ross, over to you to start off with your presentation. Thank you.
But I thought if you could crave my indulgence for a second, I'd just go through a few issues about the separation of powers doctrine and how local government in Victoria offends the separation of powers doctrine, because it actually combines powers that are normally separated, and that leads to stress and tension that are unique in governmental offices for councillors. So if we can just go through the next slide, or next part of the slide. What do I do? So I press this button.
That's it.
Okay, so sorry, this is a bit boring, but I thought, I'm giving you a bit of colour with the movie. You have to endure this. So there's essentially the separation of powers doctrine. It divides the arms of government into 4 bits that are separated and try and balance each other, but they have different attributes. So if we look at a parliament, and council's a little bit like a parliament, it's short term. People who end up in there are from the laity, they're not experts, and they're obsessed with popularity. They're a large group, and there's a lot of conflict. They yell at each other across this chamber. If we have a look at the next one along, is cabinet. So cabinet is short term. It's a member of the laity, members of the laity, they're not professional experts. They too are obsessed with popularity, but they're a small group, and conflict is kept inside, so there's no public conflict. Public service, it used to be the permanent public service, but it's gone from short term to long term. They're experts, and they've got an ambiguous relationship with popularity. And then finally there's a judiciary, who are permanent employment, they're experts, and they don't give a tinker's cuss about popularity. In fact, they revel in their own popularity. And so, if I can just go through this, if you look at the trends, across the line, employment lengthens. And the more your employment lengthens, the more you have an ability to make an independent decision. And the less stressful is unpopularity. The expertise increases as you go from one end of the continuum to another. So that, judges and public servants have much more expertise than elected officials. And then in the other direction is the obsession with popularity. So my thing about the separation of powers is that it gets appropriate people into appropriate places. So where is council in all of this thing? And this is why I say council offends the separation of powers doctrine and why it's got unique stresses. Because council's a bit like Parliament because we're elected and we do policy. It's a bit like Cabinet because we're a small group of people, and if there's any open warfare it's seen as dysfunctional. And we're a bit like a judicial tribunal because we make planning decisions which are judicial. And in judicial decisions there are winners and losers. And so that's why it's particularly stressful and very different from other forms of governmental organisation, both public service and also elected officials. So I just wanted to put that up there, just to say that when you're conducting meetings, when we're dealing with the decision-making process, Council is in a unique and I would say disadvantageous position because we have people who are skilled in one area, which is to be popular representatives, making expert judicial decisions, and the issue about conflict and suppressing of conflict is somewhere between Cabinet and Parliament, and so it's a bit unresolved and it's a bit hard for councils to have open warfare and be labelled anything other than dysfunctional, whereas Parliament has open warfare and it's seen as normal. So it's a bit unfair on councils and it's harder accordingly. So that's my answer.
Thank you, Dick. That was lovely. Roberto, we'll start at the end and work down. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. It's actually a very difficult question, at least for me, because I'm a first-term councillor and a first-time councillor. So in trying to answer the question, it becomes for whom, or part of the answer starts off for whom, because obviously councillors, council staff and residents are all very much, by default, different stakeholder groups and have different interests and different perspectives and want different outcomes. So the question has to be, for whom are council meetings designed? And part of me trying to find an answer to this question, I found myself sitting very comfortably on the picket fence with all the splinters that entails. There is a self-evident expectation gap with regards to how councillors view meetings, how residents view meetings, and how staff view meetings, and particularly the outcomes. This expectation gap largely arises because every one of those stakeholder groups all think that they've thought out and thought through the issue deciduously. They've got all the evidence, all the logic, all the rationality, they've thought through the pros and cons, and they've come to a final conclusion which will knock out any counter-argument. But once they get into the council meeting, they realise, and particularly for residents who haven't been to a council meeting before or have attended them very infrequently, they realise that it's effectively a sausage factory. And we all know that sausages at the end of the sausage factory and in the supermarkets, you know, are very tasty and blah, blah, blah. But nobody really wants to know what a sausage, what's inside a sausage or how they're in fact made. And my view of all of that is how do you, and again, I haven't really formed a coherent argument or a coherent answer to this question. But this issue of the expectation gap, the issue about the different rationales and different logics that go into it, and how people come out of that process, either satisfied or not satisfied, is one that I think is largely philosophical, but also is the proof in the eating with regards to the sausage on the barbecue. So at that sort of point of mixing up metaphors, I'll hand over.
Thank you, Roberto. We'll be coming back to your barbecue shortly. Angela, over to you.
Thanks, Gavin. I don't know about sausages. I thought I'd just share the experience that I've had chairing the meetings from the last election, which was November. And in a way, what I introduced, and what the council introduced rather, answers the second part of the question, is there a better way? The first thing we did was reconfigured the chamber, because until last November we had our backs to the gallery, That obviously isolated the polity even more. So we reconfigured it so we're in a U-shaped or horseshoe shape, and we're now facing the gallery. So I think they're already, I believe we achieved a better way of communicating and engaging the local residents, the gallery. We also introduced podcasts to our meetings, but one of the first things that we changed on my assuming the mayoralty was the way we used notices of motion. In previous council meetings, when I was a kind of minority, there was a sort of majority clique, if you will. Policies started being developed literally via notices of motion. There was no reports, there was no, orderly build-up to the policy development. It was a very arbitrary thing that was moved at that very stage, the last stage, notice of motion, often without the rest of the council being alerted to that notice of motion being placed on the agenda before we receive the papers on the Friday night. We meet on Tuesday nights. And I felt that was a very inefficient way and improper way to run the council. So a particular councillor thought that they could continue this process, and the very first meeting I chaired, that councillor introduced a notice of motion about quite a significant policy change. And I hope I'm not speaking out of turns here, but there was a discussion with the other councillors. We have 4 of the councillors are new, 7-member council, and I discussed with them the inappropriateness of that notice of motion going through that night for the reasons I just gave. There was a collective decision that that particular notice of motion, there was a whole swag of them, would not be seconded. So the motions lapsed. Now the chamber was absolutely full, and the gallery was absolutely aghast and felt that they had been, the mover had been poorly treated. But I can tell you that was the last time that councillor introduced notices of motion that way, because alongside this refusal to accept those notices of motion, I introduced a set of protocols about how the new policy development would be conducted, and it would be a discussion paper that would be listed in the briefing session, and then we could consider it, and then a report would be received from the officers, and we'd proceed that way. I know that sounds long-winded, but in my opinion, that's the kind of reforms that I think makes for a better way. And I just want to throw out to the members of the audience, or the members of the council here, I personally believe Phil Shanahan's challenge that we do away with officers and conduct council meetings solely the councillors themselves, the mayor and councillors, would be a great improvement, I believe, particularly for those councillors who do not attend the briefings beforehand. I think it would be compelling, or compel them to do the reading beforehand, be better informed, and I honestly will go back to my council and see if they will consider it, just as a trial, because I honestly believe that it would be a great improvement, and it will empower us and, as I say, perhaps shift the power back to the elected officials.
Thank you, Angela. Keep us informed as to how you get on with that.
Yeah, I will.
Thank you. Judy Madigan, former librarian, former councillor, former member of Parliament, former Speaker of the Legislative Assembly. Is there a better way, Judy, in relation to council meetings?
Thank you. Look, I'm sure there is, and Gavin has told me to try and upset you all as much as I can, so I'm just going to make a few broader comments and then perhaps come on to council meetings at the end. And some of this comes from listening to the discussion today. And firstly, like, democracy is not a cheap form of government. And I think as we take democracy for granted so much in Australia, we forget that if you really want to be a democratic organisation, if you really want to do proper community consultation, it actually is quite a costly process. And I'd be interested at the end to know that when you're designing major projects in your council, how many councils actually do put in the budget a cost for community consultation. Because if you're going to do it really properly, it does take time and it does take money. And so and some of the stuff I'm going to say is stuff that's come to me as a State Member of Parliament from residents who aren't happy with the way the councils are operating. May I say in saying that there are two people from Moonee Valley Council, my council here, and this does not apply to them because they're excellent council staff and I'm sure they'd never do anything like this. But just briefly then, informing residents of what you're doing after you've made a decision is not consultation. Taking a draft, inviting residents to come in to discuss a project you're undertaking when you've got a draft, listening to their comments, giving them no feedback, and then formally making a decision which exactly what your draft was, which they read about in the local paper, is not community consultation. And their view of you depends pretty much on how you treat them. And I guess that's the same for all of us. It's a truism, isn't it? If you think people are on your side, they normally are. If you think they're against you, they normally are. And a lot of feedback I get from residents has been, you know, the council officer treated me as though I was getting in the way of their work, that they really didn't want time. They didn't have time to talk to me, and they didn't have time to discuss things with me. They just wanted me to go away so they could get on with their work. And I think for some of you who are all at high levels of your council as officers, you probably don't have that experience with residents as much. But I guess in training your staff, what the community expects of them and how to work with them is a really important feature for councils in the future. And councils particularly, councils provide a service which is probably more important to residents than a lot of things that state and federal governments do. Because what you do is immediate, it affects their day-to-day life, and I can assure you for most people, if they can't get a question on a planning issue of something that's going to be built next door to them, that's probably far more important than changes to the Auditor General's Act that's going to go through the State Parliament. So they do actually expect quite a different level of service from you than they do from their state and federal members of Parliament, and I think it's really important that you realise that and the value that they do put in being able to have full and frank conversations with you. And so I agree with a lot of what Phil said. I think it's really important that councillors are very responsive to the community. And I've just said slightly what I've said now. Council officers have their role, and that's really important too, and that's to develop policies, to work with councillors. But in the end, councillors have to know what your policies are, or what the policies they've voted for are, and I can assure you it's very irritating, which experience I've had with some councillors, who are quite happy to vote against a policy that they passed just because some residents are upset with them. And I guess the hardest thing for anyone when they first go into politics is to learn to say no or I don't agree with you. But residents actually prefer you to be honest. If you think what they're saying is silly, they'd much prefer you, not to say it's silly, but much prefer you to say, look, we don't agree with you, I think it should be done another way. But leave them believing that you agree with them and then find out you don't afterwards. So you've got to be really honest with people, I think. I don't see why at council meetings members of the community or there can't get up and ask a question without prior notice. I don't think it's appropriate for the response which I often see from council officers, we're working on that, we'll give a report to you in 3 months' time. I don't think that council officers should respond if a member of the community asks a question to a councillor. I think councillors have to be responsive to it. And I think we should keep much better records of how much, when councillors attend meetings. So not only the public meetings, which of course are public, but also private briefings that councillors have, because I think there is a problem with some councillors and they don't get involved with that. And so they're not really in a position, in some ways, to be able to actually answer realistically questions the community might have with them. So, and in some ways, I guess it's taking a step backwards, because it's like the way councillors perhaps used to operate a bit more when they were smaller. And there's nothing more boring than someone saying, when I was a councillor, we did it this way. But I think the opportunity for councillors to build a greater respect from their community for them is beneficial to the whole council process and makes councils work a lot better. Just in finishing, next time you go and visit, and I hope you do talk to state and federal members of Parliament because they're part of your community as well. Next time you go and talk to them, Ask them how much time they spend on dealing with people complaining about councils or not getting a satisfactory response from council, and I think you might be a bit surprised at the response. So there you are with all those terrible criticisms. I'll now leave you.
Thank you, Judy. Kay Rundle, is there a better way?
Well, that's certainly an interesting one to follow. I was probably most taken a bit what Angela said with Phil's suggestion that there not be any officers at a council meeting, because that's what happens in Parliament. And when you think about it, and I hear my friends and family talking about, Minister Garrett, he should have known, about, that horrible thing with the electricity, and people actually shoot it home to the person, to the politician. They never talk about, because I know, as a public servant, what goes on behind it, who actually runs the program, but we actually hold state and federal members personally responsible, but it doesn't happen so much in council. I think it is a little bit because people do expect that council officers, and like when I was at Geelong, the Geelong area said, we want to talk to the officers because we know that that's where the real decisions happen. And that's not a good perception, and it's not a good reality. So one of the things that I certainly did with a lot of the councils I worked with is sometimes when I went there, when you had a council meeting, officers would sometimes present for up to 20 minutes on an issue, and then councillors might move and second it and vote on it. And so therefore the perception and the reality became that the officers were running it and the councillors were rubber stamping it. And so, like Angela was talking about, we made changes to ensure that the councillors were briefed enough so they spoke to it, and I think the debate should happen there. So that sort of sense of having a briefing where councillors debate, come to an agreed, and then when they go out in public, they don't have the debate, because then people, as I think Dick or Gavin was talking about, see them as dysfunctional. I think it's a real challenge with that. And so to go with having no officers, I think that'll be a really good experiment. And as Gavin said, let us know how you go. But you can certainly run it in a way that's much more respectful, that it actually is the council meeting and the officers are the servants of the council. And many, many officers do struggle with that because they are maybe not being as good as they should be in the public, but often they're being abused by the same people that they should be being responsive to, because particularly poor old planners, they just get abused every single day of their career. So that whole sort of balance between the fact that officers need to present and do a lot of the work and do good consultation, I agree with Judy there, but at the end of the day, at council meetings, they should be seen very, very much as the councillors and the meeting. Councillors can't be expected to know everything. They are huge councils. City of Greater Geelong, 230, whatever it is now, 1,000 people, to over 2,000 staff. There's no way those 12 councils can know, 13 now, or 12, 13 Jan, 12 at the moment, can know everything that's going on. But I think it needs to be just done in a way that perception and reality become the same, because as you know, perception does become reality, that the councillors really are seeing, and they do have debates. There's nothing better than people having a debate and disagreeing with each other. And what Judy says is right. I remember one time at one council when we came out in the paper and said, guess what, we stuffed up, we made a mistake and we're going to fix it up. And the other thing that I'm passionate about, and I know everyone doesn't agree with this, I don't think officers should ever, ever be quoted in the public. When do you see this head of, sometimes you do actually, recently the federal election with the Treasury coming out and saying they didn't cost the thing, but most of the time it's actually the politicians who are quoted and who stand up. And some councils do prefer that the bad news is the CEO and the good news is the mayor. That's okay. But I think it all should be, the quote should always be from the council. So that's just my new rule. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. John Benny, CEO of Dandenong. Dandenong was very progressive some years ago in webcasting, being one of the first councils to webcast their council meetings. John, over to you. Is there a better way?
Thanks, Gavin. Look, at the beginning of the stage, I guess I could say ditto to all of the previous speakers. I certainly agree with what Kay said and all of the other speakers, although I would add a word of caution about what Angela said about the rate at which you might move in the direction of implementing change, and I'll say a bit more about that. I mean, this session to me is all about the quality of decision making. And if the question is asked, is there a better way in terms of developing quality decisions, I guess the answer always has to be yes. We always need to be pursuing better decision making processes. Quality decisions, in my view, are informed decisions, decisions that deliver ultimate benefit or optimal benefit to the community and the council. And I don't think we ever take decisions that necessarily achieve those ideals or those particular outcomes. I think we've probably all now seen Phil's broadcast. I watched it on YouTube in the office late yesterday afternoon, and whilst I found it very thought-provoking, I thought Phil was probably in many respects defining the show of utopia, only in that's where we all might wish to be. But again, I make the point that I think we ought to be cautious about the rate at which we move in that direction. Our sector as a whole, and my council in particular, are absolutely committed to continuous improvement, and certainly being open-minded about the way that we do things, not being fixated on the way that we've always done things in the past. But if you are committed to continuous improvement, I think you couldn't help but respond to the question, is there a better way, and say, yes, there must be. But the issue, as I've said, is more about then the rate of change. At what rate are we prepared to move in the direction of implementing change rather than necessarily the extent of change. I don't, as I said, labour on the past, but I think the systems we've had have served us very well for many, many years. I think invariably the local government sector has delivered some very good decisions in specific municipalities. So, but notwithstanding, there is a move for change. We're seeing it in our particular council, whether it be younger generations, whether it be new entrants to our municipality, and we have many of those from many overseas countries. They're looking for things to be dealt with and addressed in another way. So we'd be foolish not to take heed of that move for change. But again, I come and I repeat the point about as we intend to move towards change, we need to phase that in aggressively. We need to protect the reliability and continuity of sound decision making that invariably exists in our models at the moment. And that's the only point I make, Andrew, about we can trial new things, but if we trial new things and we potentially jeopardise the soundness or reliability of decision making, well, we'll end well have potentially made a mistake. So if we can protect the soundness of what we've got, but then move it in the direction of what our communities are looking for, I think we will have at least moved in a forward direction.
Great, thank you, John. Councillor Susan Riley, Deputy Mayor of Melbourne.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to be different because I think council meetings don't need to be reinvented. They are a forum for formal decisions. However, at the City of Melbourne, we are refining our meetings rather than reinventing. And for example, we've introduced public question time at the beginning and the end of our future Melbourne Committee meetings, which we didn't have before, and that is twice a month. The public are welcome, and we allocate a 15-minute time slot for anyone to ask a question on any topic relating to council. We don't require any prior notice, so people can just come on in and ask. And isn't that what local government's about? So it is just another way of getting public participation in an open forum. We've also introduced audio of the committee meetings on the web, which is also a first for us, and we allow public oral submissions on all items of our future Melbourne committee meetings. So there's plenty of opportunity there for people to come on in and have a say. But I also want to be really clear, there is no blurring of accountability at the City of Melbourne. Councillors are elected to make decisions, and that is what we do. We have a strong submission culture because we want to make informed decisions based on the latest facts and figures. Now, to do otherwise would, in my opinion, and the City of Melbourne's, would be irresponsible. And that's why we listen to the views of the stakeholders, but we couldn't do that, or we just couldn't, without the officers. We need the officers. We need them to write reports because we really do believe in their professional judgment. And if we didn't do that, what would the council be like? They're there to help, and we are there to implement the decisions. So, you know, satisfaction is number one with councillors. We want to give the right thing to our stakeholders, and we do feel that if we have good information, we can work on it. If we have information we're not happy with, we have a procedure, defer, and then go away and get it right. From our perspective, the City of Melbourne does believe in the information is the most crucial thing from our officers and CEO to make the right decisions, and we wouldn't like to see that go away. Our officers are there to assist, but they are not there to participate on the debate. The council officers can sometimes present their reports, but only if a councillor asks them to speak or clarify. And I think that's also very important in the debating. In short, they are there to present and answer questions, not to enter into the debate. I think the other thing that we're seeing a lot of now is in community engagement. Everybody wants to be consulted, and it's still an area that needs a little bit more work done on, in my opinion. The community engagement programs is something that the city is always trying to achieve to the best of its ability. But no matter what the topic is, there's always somebody who comes along and says, I didn't know. And so to the best of our ability is probably the question there. So we do encourage this, and we allow presentations on agenda items to be up to 3 minutes long, so anyone that is presenting to council has the opportunity to get their point of view across very quickly. And so it is very important to get the outcomes that are positive, and that can only be a good thing. The only other thing I wanted to touch on is the notice of motions. I think they do serve a purpose, and it is something, and many times with the council, it is an officer report that can be presented back to the committee. A councillor can call that in so that we're maybe not quite happy or don't have enough information. It does give the council an opportunity to consider it further on merits, and I don't think it is something that the councillors should overdo. Though we're having a bit of a run at the moment, aren't we, Stephen May? Councillor Stephen May, we are having a bit of a run on that. But that is also really good because it is a new council, and we do have 5 new councillors, and if they want to get their points of view across, a notice of motion sometimes does give them the opportunity to get the information they need to make the right decision. So there is a role for notice of motions, and we look forward to a great future for the City of Melbourne.
Fantastic. Thank you, Councillor O'Reilly. That's good. Now, your question time, can I just ask you there, you have a section there where people can come in and verbally ask questions. Is that at your council meeting, or is it at your one of the committee meetings?
So you
Yes.
Sorry,
The question time. The question time, yeah. People can come in and ask questions. Is that that's at the council meeting, or is it at one of the committee meetings?
and it's at the committee meetings.
Committee meetings, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And the questions at question time in the formal council meeting?
No.
No. Okay, yep, no worries. Thank you. Over the crowd, just remember, Philip Shanahan is not a lunatic. He's one of the most respected people in local government, consults to 44 councils. He says, give it a thought to consider having no officers in council meetings. We've also got Councillor Altair, who's going to go back and give it a crack with her fellow councillors. Is there anyone else in this room? I look at the elected representatives and I think, would you entertain the idea of going back and giving it a crack with your fellow councillors to see whether or not a council meeting will be able to operate without any officers there? Can we have a show of hands? Ooh, it doesn't look good. It doesn't look good. Yes, oh, we've got yes. And the council? Only if it was a court. Yes, that's right. And no one here?
Yeah, we'll give it a try.
What council, sir? Alpine Shire.
Good on you.
Alpine. Is that Albert? No. That's a shake of the head. No, that's okay. That's a definite shake of the head. Fantastic.
It's not a good idea.
Kevin,
It's not a good idea. Why would you do it? I mean, when you look at the way. Sorry to go back to my analysis of the Westminster system, but like officers and councillors have 2 distinct roles, and you need both roles represented in the room when the decision's made. You do need the elected members of the laity to represent the community and try and make as informed choice as possible, but you also need the full-time experts to inform the decision, so it's not just plucking a straw out of the wind. I mean, I think that I see no upside to Phil's suggestion at all. And it is actually transparent. So when you get a highly technical report of 30 pages to do with, or 130 pages, and it's a $60 million decision, and the poor old councillors are a bit confused, so first, moved, seconded, carried, no discussion. Well, that's actually a true reflection of how some of those decisions are going to be made. You've got these full-time experts who spend 6 weeks writing a report. Of course it's going to be, it's going to probably speak for itself, and why should?
Can I add, at the City of Melbourne we have one-page reports?
Yeah.
Not 6 pages.
But isn't part of it also... Sorry, isn't part...
Before we do Roberto, can we go to Angela and then Roberto?
Obviously, I was being deliberately provocative. In fact, under our current system, the officers don't say very much at all and are there to simply answer questions. But I'm going to, obviously we need buy-in as well. I mean, I'm not just some sort of autocrat, but what I was going to say was, one of the things that the officers do, which I continue to be uncomfortable about, is we too have a public question time. It comes at the end of the meeting, and the questions must be submitted in writing on the spot. So we invite them to complete a form during the meeting. And there's all sorts of constraints. The chair